Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to start with the next thinker in our course, Machiavelli. And on Machiavelli again we are going to have 3 lectures. Here on the first lecture on Machiavelli, we will start to situate him in the larger political intellectual context of Western political thought and how he is trying to redefine the contours of politics and political theorization by differentiating the norms or the value that is associated with politics in the Christian religious theorization about the role of politics or the temporal authority. And in the second part of the first lecture, we are going to discuss Machiavelli's views on virtue and fortuna. In the second lecture on Machiavelli, we will particularly focus on his magnum opus or most widely read, discussed and debated text with competing interpretation, The Prince. And in the final lecture, we are going to focus on his another important text, that is Discourses, and then we will move on to critically assess the contribution of Machiavelli to Western political thought. So, in this lecture today we are particularly going to discuss Machiavelli's role in redefining politics and asserting its distinct or autonomous sphere from the religion or from the other concerns of our individual and collective life. And for a very long time, politics was subordinated to religion within the Christianity, and Machiavelli was the first one who began to assert the autonomy or independence of politics with its own distinct affair, with its own set of morality and ethics. And yet he was someone who is not really a modern thinker like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau and others. So, Machiavelli has a kind of peculiar situation within the Western political thought, where he is not like the Christian thinkers Saint Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, and yet he is someone who is trying to assert the autonomy of the polity by revisiting the classical text or the humanitarian interpretation of the role of politics, and how human beings themselves through their reason, through their tact, can create a polity which will allow them to lead a worthy life, and they do not have to subordinate to the fate or to the religion to lead a good moral or worthy life, as Christian philosopher or thinkers have suggested. And we will also going discuss the views on virtue and fortuna, which is at the center or at the basis of his political thinking and theorization. So, that would be the themes we are going to discuss today. So, let us start with this idea that Machiavelli is someone in Western political thought who is most elusive thinker. What does it mean that Machiavelli is the elusive thinker? So, Machiavelli has a kind of unique position in Western political thought, who is not really a philosopher like Aristotle and Plato, which we have done. He was more a kind of pragmatist or someone involved in the actual politics of his time, and wanted to unify or wanted to create a polity which would be stable, which would be effective. And how to do it, he is not guided by some a priori notion of good or bad, justice or desirable or undesirable, and that allow multiple interpretation of Machiavelli. So, often you come across the actual practical politics in any society and communities even today, to which we associate power for the sake of power, and everything goes in the politics. Its treacherousness, its tactfulness, all kind of manipulations or the negative connotation that we associate with politics is often associated with the thinking or theorization of Machiavelli. That is the dominant understanding of Machiavellian politics, However, we will see that Machiavelli's argument or theorization is much more complex than this caricatured view of Machiavelli. So, there are competing interpretation of Machiavelli thought and theorization on politics. However, he remains somewhat elusive, because the way he approached politics, the kind of advice that he gives to the king, and the way he tried to rescue the politics from the other domains of life is something very unique, something very specific to the Machiavellian theorization or modes of thinking about politics, and that makes him somewhat unique or elusive thinker in Western political thought. So, any negative connotation that you can think of politics in any society or community, such as treacherousness or deceptiveness or a cynical view of politics, is associated with Aristotle, and he is seen as someone who is a ruthlessly pragmatic thinker and argued that ends justify the means. So, one of the Machiavellian axiom is that in politics, means in itself cannot be said moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, but the end that it achieves will justify the means. So, many people will argue it that Machiavelli is suggesting that in politics, to achieve your purpose, to obtain your goal, all kind of means, ethical, unethical, evil or virtuous, are perfectly okay, so long if it helps you to achieve your desired goal or political objectives. So, he is seen as kind of ruthlessly pragmatic thinker who justified the means, all kind of means to achieve a desired political objective. So, ends justify the means. So means that a thinker or a prince will deploy is immaterial, so long the ends that such means are deployed for is desirable or help the community to achieve certain goals or help the ruler to sustain or establish their rule or authority in the community. So, he is someone who regarded that the means in itself is not something which is moral or ethical, but the ends that justify the means. So, hence ethical, unethical, all means are acceptable in politics, so long it helps the rulers achieve their political objective, and that is something which you see often in the political behavior of different parties, different leaders, driven by not ordinary conventional morality or desirable or undesirable modes of action, but anything that helps them to achieve their desired objective. Now, that is a very kind of crude understanding of Machiavellian politics, which we are going to discuss over the course of 3 lectures, that how his justification for such moral and immoral evil actions are rooted in the larger dynamics of his thought, which is to a great extent based on this Christian understanding of human being as someone who is inherently evil. And this understanding of human nature as immoral, unethical, who have fallen from the grace, is there in Hobbesian thinking also, and Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, as I have said, who established the supremacy of God and Christianity or religion and subordinated the role of politics, also have the similar notion of human nature. So, Machiavellian understanding allow us to understand that politics is not just merely ethical, moral or virtuous action, as we have seen in Plato and Aristotle, but it is also something that he has to deal with the evil, and how a ruler or governor is going to deal with that evil is something that he discussed in the Prince and also in the discourse. So, in political theorization and thinking, evils or immoral actions are also something which a ruler or the governor needs to deals with. How one is going to address those things is something which requires a knowledge, a virtue, or to avoid the negative repercussions or influence of fortuna, which we are going to discuss in the second part of the lecture. So, it is something which needs to be said, that we have to be cautious when we have a kind of crude understanding of Machiavellian politics, in a sense of everything that is immoral, treacherous, manipulative, deceptive is about the politics. He is saying something more than that and using it as a means to establish the rule and the order in the society. So, what is distinctive about Machiavelli is that he was the complete pragmatist and refuted any kind of utopian or ideal approach to politics. So, unlike Plato and Aristotle, who thought about politics as a collective exercise to achieve some common good or certain sense of justice through human reason or intellect. So, that is the classical premise of politics. Machiavelli, as a pragmatist or empirical thinker, refute all kind of such utopian a priori notion of justice and good for the polity. He was a ruthlessly pragmatist empirical thinker who wanted to change the politics as it is through the experience, through the knowledge of history, by developing the virtue and understanding that human nature is not necessarily moral or virtuous, and there are evils which persist in the society. So, how in that given objective state of human affairs one is going to create a polity which would ensure order and stability or efficiency. That was his concern, and in pursuit of such concern he refuted any kind of utopian or ideal approach to the politics. So, instead he had a historical. So, as we see in his advice to the prince, the knowledge of history is absolutely crucial for Machiavelli, even when he argues about the republican form of government or the mixed constitution in discourses. The knowledge of history is something which enables the ruler to understand the moment and the necessity of that moment, and in politics the moment is something which determines the fate of a ruler or the fate of a polity. So, when the governor or ruler are through their knowledge of history capable of understanding the moment and the necessity of that moment, the kind of action that is required, that allows the ruler to sustain their rule, to achieve glory for himself and for the principality. So, empirical or historical approach is the determining thing in Machiavellian approach to politics, not the utopian or the ideal thinking as it is there in Plato and Aristotle. So, he was the first to argue about the raison d'etre, that means the existence of politics is not for something else, it has its own legitimacy or its own justification for existence. So, this raison d'etre of politics is guided by different set of ethics which should be different from the Christian morality or ethics. So, his advice for the rulers was to govern their principalities through fear and force. However, he was also an advocate of the republican form of government and a mixed constitution, which we will see in the third lecture particularly. So, Machiavelli has therefore a kind of controversial legacy and is subjected to competing interpretation. Many scholars have presented him as the ruthless pragmatist who promoted unethical means for the ruler. So, all ethical, unethical, moral, immoral, evil, treacherous, all sorts of means are legitimate, justifiable, so long it helps the ruler to sustain his rule or achieve certain desired political objectives. So, for a number of scholars, Machiavelli is seen someone as a kind of ruthless pragmatist who support all sorts of evil practices in politics. In contrast to this interpretation of Machiavelli, there are many others who regard him as the Renaissance man or a humanist who was a republican thinker and rescued politics from the clutches of Christian theology and asserted its own autonomous and distinct sphere with distinct set of ethics or morality, and that distinguishes Machiavelli from other medieval thinker of Christian theology or their imagination of politics or temporal authority that they associated with the monarchy, which was always subordinated to the transcendental or the superior rule of the Pope or the Church. So, Machiavelli has a kind of very peculiar situation among the political thinkers in Western tradition, where he is not exactly a modern thinker and yet rooted in the Renaissance, with revisiting the classical or bringing back the humanist tradition of the classical tradition, where the human reason, human intellect itself is capable of managing the collective affairs, not the subordination to the religion or God as it is there in the Christian theology and ethics. So, there are competing interpretation of Machiavelli. Now, if you look at Machiavelli's political and intellectual context, one thing that we need to take into account is he is from Florence, Italy, and there was a kind of degeneration of Holy Roman Empire. So, Machiavelli was writing or theorizing about politics in a time when Italy, which was the seat of Roman Empire, was in turbulence, and the Roman Empire was fragmented into many principalities which was often at war with each other. And there were political uncertainties and upheavals, moral and political degeneration, violence and instabilities characterizes the governing of these principalities or the city states which had a republican form of government. So, Italian peninsula was divided and fragmented into different principalities with their own set of rules and mechanism of governing their collective life, but the politics that characterize these principalities was that of political uncertainties, violence, moral degeneration, and the constant interference by the external forces such as the ruler of the France or Spain and so on. So, Machiavelli was thinking about revival of politics or role of politics in this turbulent time of Italy. And Christian ethics and the conventional morality, which was rooted in the philosophy of two particular thinkers, Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, which provided a kind of stability to the idea of divine right of the king or the superiority of the religion to the politics or the monarchy. So, Christian ethics and the conventional morality, which was rooted in the philosophy of Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, could not provide the stability and necessary order in these principalities when Machiavelli was thinking about the role of politics. So, if we briefly look at the Saint Augustine idea, which was carried particularly by Hobbes, Machiavelli and many other political thinkers in Western tradition, particularly about his views on human nature. So, Saint Augustine in the City of Gods argued about the idea of original sin, and that becomes the basis of thinking about human nature or human characteristic, particularly when we think about the Hobbes. Human nature are nasty, brutish and sort. There is immoral, unethical or violent nature in the human being. Now, how it is possible to establish order or legitimacy for the rule given that kind of human nature that is there. So, Saint Augustine in the City of Gods argued about the idea of original sin and evil or fallen nature of human being. Hence, he argued that is contrary to the classical thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, that reason or intellect alone cannot lead man to moral ethical life. So, because of this original sin or evil nature of human character, his reason or intellect alone is not capable of ensuring the moral and ethical life for the individual. This is very contrast to the Plato and Aristotle imagination, if you recall our lectures on them, where through intellect, through reason should guide not just the human being, but also the city states or the polity. Here Saint Augustine is arguing that men are innately evil or evil nature, treacherous, fallen from the grace because of the original sin. So, reason and intellect in itself is not sufficient to lead a moral and ethical life, and therefore, they must subject themselves to the will of God. And then there is the idea of the chosen one. The redemption of life is possible when you submit to the God and God's will, and it is up to the God who are chosen to lead a moral and ethical life which is beyond the limits of human intellect and reason. So, in this assessment, politics is temporary and imperfect, and therefore, could not be the source of stability or even ethics or redemption as in the classical Greek times. So, in St. Augustine approach to the politics, it is subordinated to the role of religion. So, he subordinated therefore the politics to theology, which became the basis of the divine right of the kings or the stability in the Christendom between religious authority and the political authority. Religious is seen as the transcendental or superior authority than to the monarchy or the temporal authority of different monarchs and the kings, and there was a kind of a relationship between the religious authority and the political authority, which becomes problematic when Machiavelli was thinking or theorizing about the politics. And this is this tussle between the religious authority and the political authority that leads to the imagination of politics in the modern sense, or the secular politics, where politics has its own sphere which is independent from the religious sphere. And in the modern times, when we will discuss many modern thinkers, we will see that how religion becomes part of the personal life and has very little to determine what is the public or the political life of the city or the state or the democracies, which we will discuss later. However, the St. Augustine provided that philosophical basis for superiority of the religious authority to the temporal authority exercised by monarchy through their politics and other activities. Similarly, Thomas Aquinas regarded the supremacy of theology, but argued about the checks of the temporal power of the monarchy through a mixed constitution and the mechanism of checks and balances. So, he combined this, the Aristotelian ideas of checks and balances, the mixed constitution, and how to exercise a power in a much more reasonable way, without the excess to exploit or to involve in the immoral act that is associated with the political temporal rule. So, these two thinkers did provide a kind of stable basis for the religion or the theology to subordinate the politics. However, when Machiavelli was thinking or writing about the politics, these thinking or theorization could not provide the desirable stability and order in the principalities or in the polities. Now, Machiavelli set out to refute these Christian and the conventional morality or utopian approach to politics, and unlike Christian theology, which presented the past as a kind of linear. So, there is a kind of movement in the human affair where the movement is a kind of linear one. So, from the immoral or sinful life to the ethical or the perfect moral, religious, spiritual life is possible when the God choose the one who can achieve those life, and the movement in the history is from the sinful to the ethical, to the most holy ways of living, acting or governing the city state. So, there is kind of linearity which dominate the thinking about the time and history in Western tradition. In contrast to that, like classical thinker, Machiavelli has a kind of circular or the cyclical view of history, and this you can recall with the characterization of 6 kind of polities in Aristotle. So, you start with the monarchy, then there is movement to tyrannical regime, then aristocracy which turns into oligarchy, and then oligarchy may become polity, which again go back to democracy, and democracy again becomes the monarchy. So, the nature of the polity or the characterization of the politics that is there in Machiavelli is about the cyclical and the circular moves of history, rather than the linear movement of history that was there in the Christian theology of thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. So, for Machiavelli, this all states are subject to change, and he desired republican rule, and republican rule is basically when the citizens participate and has a say in governing the city. And Italian city states was also those states which derive inspiration from the republican notion of Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, and in governing the states citizen played an active role. So, Machiavelli wanted a republican rule if possible, but if that is not possible because of the fragmented nature of the principalities, their constant fighting with each other, then he also favored the rule by the prince or one person who could unify Italy and bring back the past glory of the Roman Empire. So, the overall objective of Machiavelli through his advice to the prince and also in the discourses is to bring back that republican form of rule that was there in the Roman Empire, the role of the Senate and other senators in governing the city. So, thus Machiavelli's political thought should be assessed in this context, when he wanted the unification of Italy and restoration of the republican form of classical Rome, and in doing so he devised a different understanding, different approach to the politics. Now, we will briefly move to the personal life of Machiavelli before we go on to discuss his ideas on virtue and fortuna. So, Machiavelli was born into a middle class family in Florence in 1469, and this family was rooted in the republican values and the humanist ethics of the Italian Renaissance, and this influenced a great deal when Machiavelli began to play active role in the politics and also his philosophy and thought. And he was someone who had personal experience in the public life of the republic. So, he entered the public life in the Florentine Republic at the age of 29, and for the next 14 years oversaw many its military and diplomatic missions, and the experience that he gained as a diplomat or an administrator was the basis of much of his political thought. When we discuss Prince and Discourse, we get to know about how his advice to the ruler and about governing is rooted in the experience or the pragmatic concern of the polity, rather than the utopian imagination or ideal thinking about the politics. So, during the diplomatic career, Machiavelli acquainted with many leaders and rulers such as popes, princes, French King Louis XII and Roman Emperor Maximilian. The ruler who influenced him the most was Caesar Borgia, and it was his rule and the fall that shaped much of his political thought. Someone who began to think about the rise and fall in the fortune of a ruler or the governing elite by looking at this example of the rise and fall of Caesar Borgia. So, he was someone who was capable, virtuous, and yet he, because of the misfortune or the unpredictable nature of the fate, he failed from the grace, and that becomes the basis of much of his political thinking and theorization. So, with the return of the former ruler of Florence, Medici family in 1512, backed by the Pope and Spanish monarchy, they re-established their rule and Machiavelli fell from the grace. So, he was actively participating in the public life of Florence, but when the Medici family, which was the former ruler of Florence, came back in 1512 and with the support of a Spanish king and the Pope re-established its rule, Machiavelli was not just asked to resign from the post and fell from the grace, but also imprisoned by this new ruler Medici family on the charges of conspiracy against the Medici family. However, he was later released, and the rest of his life he spent on thinking, theorization and writing his political treatises. So, Machiavelli was someone who regarded the writing as inferior to an active life in politics, and the Prince that he wrote was not a kind of philosophical speculation or theorization about the politics, but it was the advice that he wanted to give to the young prince of Medici family, Lorenzo di Medici, and this he wrote with the intention that the new ruler will again give him the scope to or the opportunity to participate in the public life. So, for Machiavelli, political thinking and theorization is not something which he actually loved to do or wanted to do. He wanted to play an active role in the real practical politics of his time, and the text that he wrote was also not published during his lifetime. Both the Prince and the Discourses was published after his death. So, the significance that is associated with Machiavellian political thought or philosophy is something very unique, where the man is someone who want to play an active role in the politics and write the text as a means or as a kind of instrument which will allow him to join the active life in the politics, but nothing much come out of it, and he devoted rest of his time working on the other political treatises. So, Machiavelli was a patriot and wanted the unification of Italy under a strong ruler who will be adept in the art and science of statecraft, and his whole purpose was the unification of Italy, and his political treatises, particularly the Prince, are written as an advice to such a ruler who would be adept in the statecraft and unify the Italy and bring back the republican glory of classical Rome. So, the Prince became the Bible of statecraft and continued to inspire the diplomatic exchange and the politics even today. So, the pragmatic real politics in any society even today, if you look at the politician and their behavior, are often guided by this Machiavellian tactics of out maneuvering the opponent through all kind of means that is possible. So, that is one dominant views on politics. Of course, there are other ethical, moral approach to the whole idea of politics as the pursuit of common good. However, here in Machiavelli we see politics as something which is about ensuring the order, maintaining the order and sustaining that rule that requires the knowledge of statecraft, and that is something which a ruler will learn by combining the knowledge of history with the practical necessity of the particular moment. So, no other text of political philosophy has so decisively influenced the politics and statecraft in the modern world as Machiavelli's The Prince has done, and there is a new approach to the politics required Machiavellian politics in a very crude sense. So, anything that is negative about politics we often characterize as Machiavellian politics, and Shakespeare and many other literary figures also helped in imagination of Machiavellian politics in this negative light alone. However, he is a much more complex thinker than this crude characterization. So, his famous work The Prince was written in 1513, and he also simultaneously wrote this other equally significant text, but of course, less discussed and debated, particularly when we think about Machiavellian politics in the negative terms. So, The Prince he wrote in 1513 and it was published in 1531, much after his death in 1527, and the Discourses he wrote over the 4 years between 1513 to 17, and it was also published in 31. Both these texts were published after his death in 1527, and his other lesser known works are The Art of War, which he wrote in 1521, and The History of Florence in 1527. He also wrote a play which was full of wit and humor and treacherousness of human character, which is Mandragola in 1518, and the Shakespeare characterization of murderous Machiavelli in his Othello is derived from this kind of treacherousness teachings or advice or characterization in Machiavellian politics. So, however, Machiavelli's magnum opus is The Prince, and it presents him as the ruthless pragmatist who wanted the ruler to govern based on experience from the past rather than imagination or conventional Christian pieties. So, The Prince is the most widely read text of Machiavelli after Discourse, which presented him as a pragmatist thinker who wanted his ruler or the king to govern the polity or principalities on the basis of the knowledge of history rather than the Christian or, pieties or conventional ethics. However, we shall see over the course of these 3 lectures that such caricature or crude caricature of Machiavelli is not just incorrect, but does not do justice to his complex thought. Above all, he was a Renaissance man and republican thinker who wanted politics to be in the interest of the people. Such ideas, less discussed, he present in the discourses to which we return to in the 3rd lecture. Now, we will discuss the idea of virtue and fortuna. The Machiavellian notion of virtue could be best understood in the context of his ideas on fortuna. So, these two are somewhat interlinked, and it is very difficult to understand virtue separately or separate from his views on fortuna or fortune. So, he did regard the enormous role fortuna plays in determining the prospect of human affairs or human efforts. Now, to reduce the role of fortuna or the fate which is unpredictable, which had decisive role in determining the prospect of human life or the collective endeavors, to reduce that role of unpredictable fate or fortuna in the affairs of life and particularly in maintaining order and stability in the state, Machiavelli wanted his prince to inculcate virtue. He wanted it to be developed both at the individual as well as the collective level. So, this is the something which he argues that virtue should be inculcated both at the individual and the collective level. Machiavelli, describing the role of fortuna in human affairs, write that I would compare her, which fortuna he characterized as a feminine. I would compare her, that is fortuna, to an impetuous river that when turbulent inundates the plains, casts down trees and buildings, and removes earth from this side and places it on the other. Everyone flees before it, and yet though it is of such a kind, still when it is quiet, man can make provision against it by building dikes and banks, so that when it rises, it will either go into a canal or its rushes will not be so wild and dangerous. So, that is the role of fortuna or fortune on human affairs. It is like a river with the current or the flow of water, and when it is turbulent, it is very difficult for the man, no matter how much virtuous, no matter how much efficient or strong, to withstand it. However, when the river is calm, the role of a human being is to build the dikes or channelize it such a manner where it can be used for agriculture or for other productive purposes, and also when it overflows, its devastating effect would be less. That is what he think of fortuna and the role of fortuna in human endeavors, particularly when he explains the fate of Caesar Borgia. So, he was the strong effective ruler, and yet he ended up falling from the grace and losing the respect or the glory which he earned. That could be partly explained because of the devastating role of the fortuna. So, the concept of virtue and fortuna play a central role in the political theory or philosophy of Machiavelli. One could fathom the meaning and the role of fortuna, which is the part of Greek Roman mythology as well. However, the Italian term virtù that Machiavelli uses is difficult to translate into English. So, it is not virtue or virtuous or moral action. So, it is different from the classical Greek and Roman notion of virtue like courage, honesty, temperance or wisdom. It is equally different from the conventional Christian morality, virtue or virtuous lives. So, his conception of virtù, which is the Italian term, is very different from the conventional Christian understanding of virtuous life, honesty, wisdom, temperance and so on. Cicero was the lawmaker of Greece, advised his rulers to be honest with everyone in all the contexts. So, a ruler needs to be virtuous. Now, Machiavelli questioned such advice to the ruler and refuted also the Christian theological understanding of virtue or fate as the preordained to which man must subject to or submit to. So, both the Cicero or the classical Roman understanding or the Christian theological understanding of virtue, Machiavelli refute. For him, virtue in the Machiavellian sense must be understood in a moral or ethical neutral sense, and this neutrality about the moral and ethical ideas, particularly in the Christian theology and also in the Greek classical Roman period, this idea of virtue is neutral to such moral ethical connotation. Virtue in the Machiavellian sense must be understood in a moral and ethical neutral sense, which brings the qualities of boldness, steadfastness and cunningness together. So, cunningness is like the idea of fox and boldness or steadfastness is that of a lion. So, a ruler or a prince must be bold like a lion and cunning like a fox, and virtue that he was trying to argue or define is combination of all these ability of boldness, steadfastness and cunningness together, and he regarded virtue as the basis for stability and order in the state or principalities for which prince must prepare. So, the requirement of the prince or the ruler is to develop this virtue, the virtue of boldness, steadfastness and also the cunningness. Now, the fate of a ruler according to Machiavelli rests half on his efforts or virtue, that is the qualities of being bold, steadfastness and cunning, and another half of his fate is dependent on the fortuna, which is regarded as feminine and unpredictable. So, according to Machiavelli, it is through virtue that the objective conditions must be exploited by the rulers to bring fortune or glory for himself and his principalities. So, the virtue is the ability of the ruler to exploit the objective condition. Now, it is the toughest task for individual and also those who are rulers. It often happens that in our life it becomes easy to think or reflect on the past and also have some vague sense of the future, but the toughest or the most difficult part is to understand the present, the necessity of the present and then acting upon that present movement which will determine our future. So, even in the Lincoln idea, if you think Abraham Lincoln, when he was trying to abolish slavery and there was the competing position within his own party and also among the opposition, he was someone who was arguing about that the America was going through the civil war, and to prevent this civil war and to ensure justice, it is necessary to abolish slavery. Now, that was the argument which only he could see, and had to face opposition from his own party members and also from the opposition, and yet his sense prevailed, and which led to the new era in American politics. And of course, there is the constant search for justice, equality and racial justice in the society. So, the point I am trying to make here is that the virtue for Machiavelli is that ability in the rulers which allow them to understand the objective condition and exploit it for his own glory and the stability in his principalities. This you can compare with Aristotle's idea of political judgment, which is the combination of the knowledge of ethics, which is general, and the practical wisdom which individual gains through experience. So, the public political life is necessary to have the correct political judgment according to Aristotle. However, in his political judgment, the role of ethics, which is general in nature, is very crucial, and the political judgment nonetheless requires the knowledge of the pragmatic politics or the pragmatic experience. But the difference between these two, that Machiavellian virtue and Aristotle political judgment, is that in Aristotle there is a kind of transcendental universal sense of ethics or justice. However, Machiavelli refute any such transcendental notion of ethics that could help the ruler to assess or foresee the unfolding political developments and respond to them correctly. So, the virtue is something very different from the transcendental conventional notion of ethics and justice. So, virtue requires the ruler to be wise and knowledgeable in history and adapt to the changing circumstances. So, politics is something which is constantly changing, and a wise or knowledgeable ruler should know how to respond to these changing circumstances, and that he can do when he or she has the knowledge of the history. So, the approach to politics in Machiavelli is therefore historical and also empirical, and virtue requires the ruler to have the knowledge of both the empirical circumstances as it unfolds and the historical knowledge to respond to them appropriately or accordingly. So, the prudence thus accompanied by critical foresight and intuitive grasp of the situation or the moment, and not the moral worth of an action, is the characteristic of Machiavellian virtue. It is the prudence, it is the critical foresight and intuitive grasp over the situation that makes a leader true leader, with the virtue to understand the objective condition and respond to them accordingly. So, according to Machiavelli, political virtue lies in seizing the moment. That is the most important thing for a ruler, as nothing is fixed or still in politics. As I said, that nothing is permanent, things are constantly at flux. So, how a politician or a ruler understand these changing circumstances and respond to them accordingly, and such response will determine the fate and the outcome and the glory for that particular ruler or the politician and for the principalities as a whole. So, political virtue for Machiavelli lies in seizing the moment, as nothing is fixed or still in politics, do the combined application of prudence, efficiency and flexibility. So, nothing is permanent. He wanted the ruler or the king to be flexible, to have the virtue of lion and also the fox. So, thus the necessity of the moment and nothing else should guide the political action of the rulers, and his virtue lies in identifying or foreseeing the moment and responding to them accordingly. So, the idea of virtue in Machiavelli is about the ability of the ruler to foresee the event and prepare accordingly to respond to them accordingly. So, Machiavelli argues that virtue as an attribute applies to both individuals and community as a whole. In the Prince, he focuses more upon the virtue at the individual level, i.e. the prince or the king. However, in the discourses, he focuses on the collective or civic virtue of the people for order and justice in the state, and to ensure the liberties for the individual. So, lack of such virtue according to Machiavelli, particularly the political and the military virtue, which was lacking among the citizens when Machiavelli was trying to unify or arguing about the unification of Italian principalities. He believed that the lack of such virtue, political or military, resulted in the political instabilities and degeneration of Roman city states. So, having the cyclical understanding of history, Machiavelli was also aware that whatever the virtue of the ruler or ruled, fortuna cannot be fully tamed. It will remain the other half which shapes the human endeavors and also the conditions of polity and the principalities. So, to conclude, the Machiavellian understanding of virtue is to be seen in the context of fortuna, which play a decisive role in human endeavors and human efforts to govern their life, to achieve certain political objectives. Now, what is left for individual rulers or the republics as a whole to do is to develop certain capacity, certain boldness, certain cunningness to minimize the influence of fortuna, and that can be done by inculcating the virtue. So, in the case of principalities, it has to be a prince who is prudent enough, have intuitive knowledge of the situation and how to respond to them accordingly. In the case of republic, citizen as a whole should develop that virtue, the civic virtue, to govern their collective life. But no matter how much one is capable or have virtue or political or military virtue, the fate or the fortuna and its role cannot be fully tamed. It will yet defy the preparedness or the virtue of the rulers or the citizenry and can determine the fate of this. So, that is the kind of cyclical views about the history or the nature of polity that Machiavelli had, which was different from the linear understanding in the Christian theology. So, I hope you get to know from today's lecture about Machiavelli's political and intellectual context, how he defines politics as a pragmatic empirical science about politics, which is different from the utopian and ideological imagination of politics, and also his views on virtue and fortuna. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss his views on prince or how to govern principalities, hereditary rule or the king who acquire principality on the basis of his own abilities. So, the advice that he gave to the prince we will move to discuss in the next lecture, and in the final lecture we are going to discuss his views on discourses and how to govern a republic. So, republican ideals of Machiavelli political philosophy we are going to discuss in the third lecture. So, for today's lecture you can refer to some of their texts like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, political thinkers. Gary Browning is also a very good text to understand the interpretation of Machiavellian thought. A history of modern political thought, the questions of interpretation you can refer to, and Murray, Forsyth and Moriskin Soper, a guide to political classic, Plato to Aristotle, Cephalija, Western political thought, and Alan James Wren on politics, a history of political thought from Herodotus to the present. So, these are some of the texts you can refer to understand Machiavelli's political intellectual context and also his views on virtue and fortuna. So, that is all in today's lecture. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.